Welcome to our QTM preliminary project. So, the general basis of this study is to measure American populace's health values and beliefs. So, basically, we took ours specifically from the American Health Value Surveys, which was conducted by the National Opinion Research Center. So, in our case, we focused on the correlation between frequency of smoking and the presence or absence of respiratory diseases. So, we measured these in categories of every day, some days, or not at all, and we measured it in relation to yes or no in the presence or absence of respiratory diseases. So in this general consensus, we literally just try to examine how Americans really just interact with how cigarette smoking affects their personal health and how the effects can affect other people. So if we go to the next one, we have our research question, which is, does the frequency of smoking correlate to diagnosis with respiratory diseases such as asthma, emphysema, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is in relation to the heart? So our rationale around this study is that because in the mid-20th century, smoking was so abundant from early ages to elderly people, it was almost acted like a pastime, and the prevalent health problems that were going to ensue weren't really apparent. So with this examination, we were able to see in what extent that individuals recognize the association between the frequency of smoking and diagnosed health problems. So we can see this correlation between how frequent someone smokes in relation to if the presence or absence of a respiratory disease, such as the ones we've listed before.
So with our research question, we have our hypotheses. The null hypothesis for our study is that there's no association between the frequency of smoking cigarettes and respiratory disease diagnosis. And the alternative hypothesis thing we're looking for is that there is an association between the frequency of smoking cigarettes and respiratory disease diagnosis. The rationale for our hypotheses is that research indicates that people with higher exposure to smoking cigarettes are more likely to be susceptible to respiratory disease diagnosis. As we know that there's really a lot of risk factors that come along with carcinogens and smoking cigarettes and nicotine, not only for the person smoking, but for also the people around them. So the variables that we chose from the data set were HL_CO_8, which is the response variable, the variable that we're looking for, that the explanatory variable will explain. It's a dichotomous variable, and basically the description of the variable is participants answered the question, has a doctor or healthcare provider ever told you that you had emphysema, asthma, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is all classes of respiratory diseases, and people answered either yes or no, or one or two to mean yes or no. And the other variable that we were using as our explanatory variable, it has 3 levels. It is cigarette frequency, another categorical variable, and the description of this variable are participants responded to the question, do you smoke cigarettes every day, some days, or not at all? And they responded by 1, meaning every day, 2, meaning some days, and 3, meaning not at all. So in order to recode our variables, we had to recode them because they were inputted as numbers. So for the diagnoses variable, our response variable, the original categories were 1 and 2, 1 meaning yes and 2 meaning no, and we just recoded them as yes and no.
So, by acknowledging the presence or absence of these respiratory diseases, we can basically observe whether or not these individuals do have a correlation between the frequency of smoking cigarettes and developing a respiratory disease. So, the study is interested in categories of yes and no to develop that correlation.
And for the other variable, cigarette frequency, the original categories were 1 meaning every day, 2 meaning some days, and 3 meaning not at all. And we just recoded them as every day, some days, and not at all.
The researchers categorized the individuals by the question, do you smoke cigarettes every day? And so these normal categorical variables are now such as every day, some days, and not at all. And so this way we'll be able to correlate the frequency of an individual's smoking habits to the presence or absence of a respiratory disease. And we can see the causation effect between the two variables.
So the plot that we used is a bar plot with side by side of the 3 explanatory variable levels. every day, some days, and not at all. We used proportions of columns. So each category within the explanatory variables adds up to one for the proportions of yes and no.
Okay, so our statistical analysis involved a chi-square test, more specifically a test for independence, which evaluates the relationship between two categorical variables, one with 2 levels, which in this case is the respiratory disease diagnosis, and one with 3 levels, which is the smoking frequency. And here we've created a two-way contingency table for the outcomes of 2 variables. If we can go to the next slide. So in regard to the assumptions for the chi-square test to ensure that we can use it, that involves randomization, which this data set was randomly received, and independence, and each trial is independent of the next. So in addition, you have to ensure that the sample size is enough. So in the chi-square test, that involves making sure that the expected cell count is greater than 5 in all cells. So at the bottom of the slide, you can see we did the expected cell count calculation to make sure that the sample size was sufficient. And then our results for the chi-square test. The chi-square value is 139.07, and this large chi-square value suggests strong evidence in favor of the alternative hypothesis. In addition, our p-value is 2.2 times 10 to the negative 16, which is a lot less than 0.05, so the test does yield significant results that allow us to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis.
So ultimately, using the chi-square test, we found that individuals who do perceive a higher frequency of smoking from the levels every day, some days, and not all, are more likely to receive a respiratory disease diagnosis. And this indicates that one motivation for avoiding smoking is related to health risk, usually related to those diseases. However, some individuals who perceive a lower frequency of smoking but still do suffer from the same diseases may be due to secondhand smoking. So, and additionally, although the distribution of individuals from all categories don't vary by a wide margin, it is noted that degenerative disorders in sometimes weaker forms are prevalent among smokers of different smoking habits. So future research should explore additional research reasons for avoiding smoking, like preventative treatments, educational courses, endorsement, etc. And it's also important to note precautions of secondhand smoking as well and how it can affect individuals in the general vicinity.
All right, and that's it.